The sands of Arrakis, vast and unyielding, whisper tales of destiny, power, and sacrifice. As the brutal Harkonnen grip tightens, and the Emperor's betrayal echoes across the galaxy, Attreidees, once a noble heir, now a freeman leader, stands poised to fulfill a prophecy as old as the desert itself. But the journey ahead is fraught with peril. With the love of Chani grounding him and the unwavering faith of the freeman behind him, Attreidees must navigate the treacherous sands of politics and war. His visions of a fiery jihad weigh heavily on his soul, warning of a future drenched in blood, while his newfound powers continue to grow, reshaping the destiny of the known universe. Enemies old and new rise against him. House Harkonnen, desperate to reclaim their control, the Emperor, fearful of losing his throne, and forces within the desert itself, as wild and unpredictable as the sands that shift beneath their feet. This is the tale of the revolution, the rise of Muad'Dib, and the battle for the soul of Arrakis. The sands will remember, and history will be written in spice and blood. Chapter 1. The Whispering Sands. The desert wind howled like a restless spirit, whipping against the rugged cliffs of Sietch Tabr and carrying with it the fine grains of Arrakis' endless sands. The Sietch bustled with activity as the freemen prepared for what was to come. The fall of House Atreidees had ignited a revolution, and in the heart of it stood Paul Attreidees, now known to the freemen as Muad'Dib. Paul sat cross-legged in the Sietch's great hall, a cavernous chamber carved into the rock, its walls illuminated by the faint glow of luminescent fungi. He was deep in thought, his piercing blue eyes reflecting the weight of his burgeoning responsibilities. His mind was a storm of visions, a kaleidoscope of possible futures that all seemed to lead to one inevitable conclusion: war, blood, and fire. Lady Jessica, seated nearby, watched her son with a mix of pride and concern. She had always known that Paul's destiny was greater than most could comprehend, but the enormity of it still sent chills down her spine. "You're restless," Jessica said, breaking the silence. Paul's gaze shifted to his mother. "The visions, they're clearer now, more vivid. I see the paths we can take, and the consequences of each. But they all lead to the same place, a war that consumes the galaxy." Jessica leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "You've always known this was your path, Paul. The Kwisatz Haderach is not a figure of peace. You're meant to bring change, even if it comes at a cost." Paul nodded but did not reply. The weight of his mother's words was not lost on him. He rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, and made his way to the outer edge of the Sietch. The freemen, recognizing their leader, stepped aside, their expressions a mixture of reverence and resolve. Chani appeared by his side, her presence grounding him. "You're troubled," she said, her voice soft. Paul glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "I always am, but being near you helps." Chani's eyes searched his face. "The freemen are ready, Muad'Dib. We've waited our whole lives for this moment. You've given us hope. Don't doubt yourself now." Paul reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "It's not myself I doubt. It's the cost of what we're about to do. The lives that will be lost, the future I see in my dreams. It's not the future I would choose for us." Chani tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the desert chooses for us. We can only trust in Shai-Hulud and walk the path we've been given." Their conversation was interrupted by Stilgar's arrival. The Nabe of Sietch Tabr was a commanding presence, his weathered face a testament to a life lived in service to the desert and his people. "Muad'Dib," Stilgar said, bowing his head slightly. "The tribes are gathering as you commanded. They await your words." Paul inhaled deeply, steeling himself. "Then let's not keep them waiting." The great hall of the Sietch was filled to capacity. Hundreds of freemen, from warriors to watermasters, had assembled, their faces lit with anticipation. Paul stood at the forefront, his crysknife strapped to his side and the mantle of leadership heavy on his shoulders. "My people," Paul began, his voice carrying across the chamber. "For generations, you have lived under the heel of oppression. The Harkonnens and the Emperor have treated you as nothing more than tools to harvest spice. They've denied your humanity, your freedom, your right to live as you choose." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger palpable. "But no more," Paul continued. "We have the power to change our fate. The desert has given us strength. It has made us who we are. And now, with the tribes united, we will show the Harkonnens and the Emperor that the freemen are not to be trifled with." A cheer erupted from the crowd, echoing off the stone walls. Paul raised a hand, and the room fell silent once more. But we must not take this lightly. The path ahead will be difficult. Many of us will not see the end of this journey. But if we succeed, we will create a world where our children can live free, where the desert is ours and ours alone. Cheney stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. Muad'Dib speaks the truth. We have lived in the shadows for too long. Now is the time to rise. For our people, for Arrakis, for the future. The room erupted into a thunderous roar, the freemen's resolve unshakable. As the gathering dispersed, Paul retreated to a quiet corner of the sietch, his thoughts heavy. Jessica found him there, her expression unreadable. "You spoke well," she said. Paul looked at her, his eyes shadowed. "Words are easy, Mother. It's the actions that follow that will define us." Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let your actions speak for themselves. You were born for this, Paul. Trust in yourself." That night, Paul stood on a high dune overlooking the desert, the stars shining like diamonds above him. The wind whispered through the sands, carrying with it the hopes and fears of an entire people. In the distance, he saw the faint outline of a sandworm cresting the dunes, its massive body a testament to the power of the desert. Paul knew that the days ahead would test him in ways he could scarcely imagine. But he also knew that he could not turn back. The whispering sands of Arrakis called to him, and Paul Attreidees Muad'Dib would answer. Chapter 2. Beneath the Crescent Moons. The twin moons of Arrakis cast their pale light over the endless dunes, their glow reflected in the watchful eyes of the freemen as they gathered in the cavernous sietch. Paul Attreidees, now known as Muad'Dib, stood among them, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. The echoes of their earlier counsel still reverberated in his mind, but the night called for action, not reflection. The freemen, clad in their stillsuits, prepared for the night's mission with quiet efficiency. They moved like shadows, their movements deliberate and precise, a testament to lives spent surviving the harsh desert. Paul's gaze swept over them, taking in the hardened expressions, the gleam of crysknives, and the fierce determination etched into every face. At his side, Cheney whispered softly, her voice a calming presence amidst the tension. "They're ready, Muad'Dib. Tonight, we strike a blow that will echo across Arrakis." Paul nodded, his blue-within-blue eyes meeting hers. "Then we'll make it count." The Freeman operation that night was as audacious as it was dangerous. They aimed to sabotage a Harkonnen spice harvester, one of the massive machines that plowed through the desert, extracting the precious melange that fueled the Imperium. Destroying such a machine was more than an act of defiance. It was a declaration of war. Stilgar approached, his weathered face set in grim determination. "Muad'Dib, the teams are in position. The Harkonnen patrols will not suspect an attack under the moons." "Good," Paul replied. "We strike hard and fast. Leave no trace of our presence except the wreckage." As they set out into the desert, the freemen moved in near silence, their sand-colored cloaks blending seamlessly with the dunes. Paul rode alongside Stilgar and Cheney, his mind racing with strategies and contingencies. His visions had shown him glimpses of this night, but the outcomes were as uncertain as the shifting sands. The journey to the spice harvester was uneventful, the only sounds the soft hiss of sand beneath their feet and the occasional whisper of the wind. As they approached their target, Paul raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. The harvester loomed before them, a behemoth of machinery illuminated by harsh floodlights. Its massive treads churned the sand as it crawled across the desert, oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. Paul surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes picking out the positions of Harkonnen guards and the vulnerable points of the machine. He turned to Stilgar. "Take your team to the south side and plant the explosives. Cheney, you lead the diversionary team to draw their attention. I'll coordinate from here." Stilgar nodded, his respect for Paul evident in his compliance. "It will be done, Muad'Dib." The freemen moved into position with practiced ease, their stillsuits muffling their movements. Paul watched as Cheney and her team created a distraction, launching a flurry of projectiles at the guards stationed around the harvester. The guards scrambled in confusion, their shouts carrying across the desert as they scrambled to locate their attackers. Meanwhile, Stilgar's team worked swiftly to plant explosives along the vulnerable underbelly of the harvester. Paul monitored their progress through his binoculars, his heart pounding as the seconds ticked by. The first explosion shattered the night, a deafening roar that sent a plume of fire and sand into the air. The harvester lurched, its massive frame shuddering as more explosions followed in quick succession. The freemen cheered as the machine buckled and collapsed, a smoldering ruin in the desert. But their victory was short-lived. The roar of engines signaled the arrival of Harkonnen reinforcements, and Paul's instincts kicked into overdrive. "Fall back!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Regroup at the designated point." The Freemen retreated with precision, their movements as fluid as the desert wind. Paul stayed at the rear, ensuring everyone made it out safely. He fired his weapon with deadly accuracy, picking off Harkonnen soldiers who ventured too close. Cheney appeared at his side, her expression fierce. "We need to move, Paul. They'll send more troops." "I know," Paul replied, his tone grim. "Let's go." They disappeared into the dunes, leaving the wreckage of the Harvester behind. The Harkonnen forces pursued them briefly, but were no match for the Freemen's knowledge of the terrain. By the time the sun began to rise, Paul and his people were safely back in the Sietch, their spirits buoyed by the success of their mission. The mood in the Sietch was celebratory, but Paul remained subdued. He stood at the edge of the gathering, his thoughts once again consumed by the future. Jessica approached him, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You've done well," she said, her voice soft. Paul turned to her, his eyes shadowed. "We won a battle, Mother, but the war is just beginning. The Harkonnens won't take this lightly. They'll retaliate." Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder. "And when they do, you'll be ready. You've given the Freemen something they've never had before, hope. That's a powerful weapon." Paul nodded, but his gaze drifted to the horizon, where the desert stretched out endlessly. The twin moons had set, but their light lingered in his mind, a reminder of the path he had chosen. As the Freemen celebrated their victory, Paul Attreidees stood apart, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the desert. He knew that the battles ahead would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. But he also knew that he was no longer just Paul, and the desert had claimed him as its own. Chapter 3. The Sands of Betrayal. The skies above Arrakis swirled with an ominous energy, clouds gathering on the horizon like the prelude to a violent storm. Deep within the Sietch, the Freemen prepared for the next phase of their resistance against the Harkonnens, their movements purposeful and unrelenting. Paul Attreidees, their leader and the figurehead of revolution, stood at the center of it all, his mind a maelstrom of visions and strategies. Word of the destroyed spice harvester had spread quickly, carried by whispers and the winds of the desert. The Harkonnens had already begun mobilizing their forces, and the Freemen knew it was only a matter of time before retaliation came. But rather than wait for the storm to strike, Paul intended to meet it head-on. "We have to hit them before they regroup," Paul said, addressing a council of Freeman leaders in the Sietch's main chamber. The room was dimly lit, the glow from the bioluminescent fungi casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. "The Harkonnens will send their forces to secure the spice fields. That's where we strike next." Stilgar nodded, his expression grave. "The spice fields are heavily guarded, Muad'Dib. They'll expect resistance after what we did to the harvester." Paul met Stilgar's gaze, his voice firm. "They'll expect it, but they won't anticipate the scale of our assault. We hit them with everything we have, every tribe, every fighter. We show them that the Freemen are a force they cannot contain." Jessica, standing near the edge of the chamber, studied her son with an unreadable expression. She recognized the fire in his eyes, the resolve that marked him as a leader, but she also saw the weight of the choices he had made. "Your plan is bold," she said, her voice cutting through the low murmurs of the council. "But boldness alone won't win this war. You must consider the risks." Paul turned to his mother, his tone calm but resolute. "I've considered them, Mother. The spice is the lifeblood of the Imperium. If we control it, we control the future." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly, but she did not argue further. She could see that Paul's mind was set, and she knew better than to try to dissuade him when his vision was clear. The council dispersed to carry out Paul's orders, and the Sietch buzzed with activity as the Freemen prepared for battle. Paul retreated to a quiet alcove, seeking a moment of solitude before the storm. Cheney found him there, her presence a balm to his restless mind. "You carry so much, Muad'Dib," she said softly, sitting beside him. "But you don't have to carry it alone." Paul looked at her, his expression softening. "I know, Cheney, but the responsibility is mine. If I falter, everything we've built will crumble." Cheney reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You won't falter. The desert has chosen you, and so have we. Trust in that." Her words gave him strength, and he nodded, his resolve renewed. As the sun set over the dunes, the Freemen assembled at the edge of the Sietch. Hundreds of warriors, armed and ready, stood in disciplined rows, their faces obscured by the masks of their stillsuits. Paul stood before them, his crysknife glinting in the fading light. "Tonight, we strike a blow that will be felt across the Imperium," he said, his voice carrying over the assembled warriors. "We are not just fighting for ourselves, but for the future of Arrakis. The Harkonnens think they own this desert, but they do not understand it. They do not understand us. Tonight, we show them the power of the Freeman." A cheer rose from the crowd, a fierce and primal sound that sent shivers down Paul's spine. He raised his hand, and the warriors fell silent, their attention fixed on him. "The storm is coming," Paul said, his voice low but charged with intensity. "And we are its fury." The Freemen moved out under the cover of darkness, their movements swift and silent. Paul led the main force, with Stilgar and Cheney at his side. The spice fields lay several kilometers away, a sprawling expanse of machinery and guards that glowed faintly under the light of the moons. As they approached, Paul signaled for the group to halt. He surveyed the field, noting the placement of the guards and the machinery. The Harkonnens had fortified the area, but Paul's sharp mind quickly identified the weak points. "Stilgar, take your team and flank them from the east," he said. "Cheney, lead the sabotage team to the storage units. I'll coordinate the main assault from here." The Freemen moved into position with precision, their training and discipline evident in every step. When the first crysknife struck, it was like a spark igniting dry tinder. The Freemen attacked with the ferocity of a sandstorm, overwhelming the Harkonnen guards in a matter of minutes. Explosions lit up the night as Cheney's team destroyed the spice storage units, sending plumes of fire and smoke into the air. The Harkonnen forces, caught off guard by the sheer intensity of the assault, scrambled to mount a defense but were quickly overwhelmed. Paul fought at the forefront, his crysknife a blur as he struck down enemy after enemy. His movements were fluid and precise, each strike a testament to his training and the desert's harsh lessons. The Freemen fought beside him, their loyalty to Muad'Dib unshakable. As the battle raged, Paul felt the strange pull of his visions, fragments of possible futures flickering through his mind. He saw himself standing victorious, the Freemen triumphant, but he also saw the cost, the lives lost, the blood spilled, the galaxy engulfed in chaos. When the last of the Harkonnen forces were defeated, the Freemen regrouped, their cheers of victory echoing across the dunes. Paul stood among them, his crysknife stained with blood and his heart heavy. Stilgar approached, his face grim but satisfied. "The spice field is ours, Muad'Dib. The Harkonnens won't recover from this." Paul nodded, his gaze distant. "This is just the beginning. The Harkonnens will come back, and when they do, they'll bring everything they have." Stilgar placed a hand on Paul's shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the Freemen began their journey back to the Siege, their spirits high despite the losses they had suffered. Paul walked among them, his thoughts a tangle of triumph and foreboding. The storm had begun, and Paul Attreidees, Muad'Dib, stood at its edge, ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 4. The Price of Rebellion. The desert shimmered under the unrelenting heat of the Arrakis sun, its golden sands stretching endlessly in every direction. The aftermath of the attack on the spice fields had left a lingering tension in the air, a sense of both triumph and foreboding that hung over the Freemen like a heavy shroud. Paul Attreidees, their leader, sat in quiet contemplation within the Siege, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The Freemen had struck a decisive blow against the Harkonnens, crippling their spice production and asserting their dominance over the desert. But victory came at a cost. Lives had been lost, and the retaliation that Paul knew would follow loomed like a shadow over their newfound strength. Paul's quarters were dimly lit, the flickering glow of a single lamp casting elongated shadows on the stone walls. He ran a hand through his hair, his blue-within-blue eyes fixed on the map spread out before him. It detailed the known spice fields, Harkonnen strongholds, and the strategic points of the desert. Each mark on the map represented a potential opportunity, or a potential threat. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Cheney entered, her movements graceful and deliberate. She carried a tray with 2 cups of spiced tea, the aromatic scent filling the room. "You've been here for hours, Muad'Dib," she said, setting the tray down. "You need to rest." Paul offered her a faint smile, though his expression remained troubled. "There's no time for rest, Cheney. The Harkonnens will retaliate. They'll send their Sardaukar, and the next battle will be far bloodier." Cheney sat beside him, her eyes searching his face. We knew this fight would demand sacrifices. The freemen are prepared to face whatever comes. But you, Paul, you bear this burden alone. Let us share it with you." Paul reached for her hand, drawing strength from her touch. "I'm not alone, Cheney. I have you, and I have the freemen. But the weight of leadership, it's something I can't escape." Cheney leaned in closer, her voice a whisper. "You are Muad'Dib, the one who will lead us to freedom. But even Muad'Dib needs a moment to breathe." Her words settled over him like a bomb, and for a brief moment, Paul allowed himself to relax. He took a sip of the spiced tea, its warmth spreading through him. The visions that often plagued his mind seemed to recede, if only slightly. But the reprieve was short-lived. Stilgar entered the room, his expression grim. "Muad'Dib, the scouts have returned. The Harkonnens are mobilizing their forces. A large convoy is moving toward one of the southern Sietches." Paul stood immediately, his demeanor shifting to that of a leader. "How many?" "Enough to overwhelm the Sietch if we don't intervene," Stilgar replied. "They're bringing armored vehicles and troops. It's clear they intend to send a message." Paul nodded, his mind racing. "Then we'll send a message of our own. Assemble the fighters. We'll intercept them before they reach the Sietch." The freemen mobilized with astonishing speed, their readiness a testament to their discipline and resilience. Paul led them into the desert, the harsh winds whipping at their cloaks as they moved under the cover of twilight. The convoy's location had been marked on the map, and Paul had already devised a plan to turn the sands against the Harkonnens. The ambush was set at a narrow pass between two towering dunes. Paul positioned his forces strategically, using the terrain to their advantage. The freemen buried explosives beneath the sand, concealed themselves among the dunes, and waited for the convoy to arrive. As the sound of engines grew louder, Paul's heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and dread. He knew the stakes of this battle. If they succeeded, it would further cripple the Harkonnen forces. But if they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The convoy came into view, a line of armored vehicles flanked by heavily armed soldiers. Paul signaled for his fighters to hold their positions, his sharp eyes scanning the formation for weaknesses. When the lead vehicle reached the center of the pass, Paul gave the signal. The explosives detonated with a deafening roar, sending plumes of sand and fire into the air. The lead vehicle was destroyed instantly, and chaos erupted among the Harkonnen forces. The freemen descended upon the convoy like a sandstorm, their crysknives gleaming in the fading light. Paul fought at the forefront, his movements precise and deadly. He struck down Harkonnen soldiers with a fury that seemed almost otherworldly, his crysknife an extension of his will. Cheney fought beside him, her movements fluid and deadly. Together, they carved a path through the enemy, their synergy a testament to their bond. The Harkonnens fought back fiercely, their advanced weaponry cutting down several freeman warriors. But the desert itself seemed to rise against them, with sandworms drawn to the vibrations of the battle. The massive creatures emerged from the dunes, their thunderous roars drowning out the sounds of combat. Paul used the chaos to his advantage, leading his forces to target the remaining vehicles. The battle raged on, the sands of Arrakis stained with blood. When the dust finally settled, the freemen stood victorious. The convoy lay in ruins, its soldiers either dead or captured. But the cost of victory was steep. Many freemen had fallen, their bodies now part of the desert they had fought to protect. Paul stood amidst the wreckage, his crysknife still in hand. The weight of the battle bore down on him, a stark reminder of the price of rebellion. Stilgar approached, his face lined with grief. "We've won, Muad'Dib. But the losses?" Paul's voice was heavy. "They knew the risks. They fought for their freedom, and their sacrifice will not be in vain." As the freemen began to gather their fallen, Paul turned his gaze to the horizon. The storm he had envisioned was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it was merciless. That night, back at the Sietch, the freemen mourned their dead. Songs of remembrance filled the air, their haunting melodies a tribute to those who had given their lives. Paul sat in silence, his thoughts consumed by the weight of his decisions. Jessica found him alone, her expression unreadable. "You carry their deaths as if they were your fault," she said. "They trusted me," Paul replied, his voice low. "And I led them into battle." Jessica's gaze softened. "Leadership means making difficult choices. You gave them hope, Paul. Without you, they would have no chance against the Harkonnens." Paul looked at her, his eyes shadowed. "But at what cost, Mother? How many more will die before this is over?" Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder. "As many as it takes to ensure that their sacrifice means something. You are more than their leader, Paul. You are their future. Her words stayed with him long after she left. As the siege fell silent, Paul Attreidees sat alone, his gaze fixed on the desert beyond. The storm had claimed its first victims, but the fight was far from over. Paul clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. The Harkonnens would pay for every life lost, and the Freemen's rebellion would not be in vain. The desert had chosen him, and he would see this fight through to the end. Chapter 5. The Beast Unleashed. The desert winds screamed over the dunes, carrying with them the whispers of a rebellion that could no longer be contained. Deep within the labyrinthine tunnels of the Siege, the Freemen prepared for a new phase of their war against the Harkonnens, their resolve sharpened by both victory and loss. Paul Attreidees Muad'Dib stood at the heart of it all, his mind a cauldron of strategy, prophecy, and the ever-present pull of destiny. The reports from Stilgar were grim but expected. The Harkonnens, humiliated by their recent defeat, had summoned reinforcements from the Emperor's Sardaukar legions. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were the Imperium's elite, trained to kill with ruthless efficiency. The Freemen had faced overwhelming odds before, but Paul knew that the arrival of the Sardaukar marked a turning point. In the council chamber, Paul addressed the Freemen leaders, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his mind. The bioluminescent fungi lining the walls cast a faint glow over the room, illuminating the hardened faces of those who had pledged their lives to the desert's cause. "The Sardaukar are coming," Paul began, his gaze sweeping over the gathered warriors. "The Emperor and the Harkonnens believe they can crush us with brute force. They think we're nothing more than desert scavengers, unworthy of standing against their might." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of anger and defiance. Paul raised a hand, and silence fell. "They are wrong," he continued. "We are not scavengers. We are the desert's wrath, its voice, its fury. The Sardaukar may have their training, their weapons, and their numbers, but they do not have what we have. They do not have the desert. They do not have the spice. And they do not have the Freemen." A cheer erupted, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Paul allowed the moment to build before speaking again. "But this will not be easy," he said, his tone sober. "The Sardaukar are relentless. They will not hesitate to kill every man, woman, and child in their path. To defeat them, we must be stronger, smarter, and more united than ever before." Jessica watched from the shadows, her sharp mind assessing her son's every word. She saw how the Freemen hung on his every syllable, their faith in him unshakable. Yet she also saw the toll this burden was taking on Paul, the weight of leadership pressing down on him like the crushing sands of a dune. After the council dispersed, Paul retreated to his quarters, seeking a moment of quiet. Chani found him there, her presence as constant and grounding as the desert itself. "You spoke well," she said, sitting beside him. "The Freemen believe in you." Paul nodded, his expression distant. "Belief is powerful, but it's not enough. We need strategy, precision. The Sardaukar won't be defeated by faith alone." Chani placed a hand on his arm. "Then show them why the desert chose you. Show them why you are Muad'Dib." Her words lit a spark within him, and he rose, his resolve hardening. "I will," he said, his voice firm. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Paul worked tirelessly with Stilgar and the other Freeman leaders, devising a plan to counter the Sardaukar's advance. They studied the terrain, identifying choke points and ambush sites. The sandworms, those massive creatures that ruled the desert, would play a critical role. Paul's bond with the worms, forged through his deepening connection to the spice and the desert, gave the Freemen an edge the Sardaukar could never anticipate. When the Sardaukar finally arrived, they did so with the arrogance of conquerors. Their dropped ships descended upon Arrakis with a deafening roar, their forces spilling out onto the sands like a plague. Clad in their dark armor, the Sardaukar moved with disciplined precision, their weapons gleaming under the harsh sunlight. Paul watched from a ridge overlooking the battlefield, his keen eyes taking in every detail. The Freemen lay hidden among the dunes, their still suits blending seamlessly with the sand. The tension in the air was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. Paul raised a hand, signaling the first phase of the plan. Explosives buried beneath the sand detonated, throwing the Sardaukar into disarray. The Freemen emerged from their hiding places, striking with the ferocity of a sandstorm. The battle that followed was unlike any the desert had seen before. The Sardaukar, for all their training and discipline, were unprepared for the Freemen's unconventional tactics. They were outmaneuvered at every turn, their formations disrupted by the shifting sands and the sudden, devastating attacks of the Freemen. Paul fought at the forefront, his crysknife a blur as he took down enemy after enemy. His movements were fluid and precise, a dance of death that left the Sardaukar reeling. Beside him, Chani fought with equal ferocity, her blade cutting through the enemy with ruthless efficiency. The turning point came when the sandworms joined the fray. Drawn by the vibrations of the battle, the massive creatures emerged from the dunes, their gaping maws swallowing Sardaukar soldiers and vehicles whole. The sight of the worms sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks, their fear palpable. Paul used the chaos to his advantage, leading his forces in a coordinated assault that broke the Sardaukar's lines. The Freemen pressed their attack, their cries of Muad'Dib ringing out across the battlefield. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battle drew to a close. The Sardaukar, their numbers decimated and their morale shattered, retreated under the cover of darkness. The Freemen, battered but victorious, gathered to assess their losses and tend to the wounded. Paul stood amidst the carnage, his crysknife still in hand. The weight of the battle bore down on him, a stark reminder of the cost of rebellion. But as he looked at the faces of the Freemen around him, he saw something that gave him hope: determination, unity, and the unyielding spirit of a people who would not be broken. Stilgar approached, his face lined with exhaustion but lit with pride. "The Sardaukar are not invincible," he said. "We've proven that tonight." Paul nodded, his gaze distant. "But they'll be back, and next time, they'll bring even greater force." Stilgar placed a hand on Paul's shoulder. "Then we'll face them, as we always have. Together." That night, as the Freemen celebrated their hard-won victory, Paul found a moment of solitude. He climbed to the top of a dune, the desert stretching out before him like an endless sea. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, their light cutting through the darkness. Paul Attreidees Muad'Dib stood alone with his thoughts. The storm he had unleashed was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain: the desert had chosen him, and he would not falter. Chapter 6. The Whisper of Prophecy. The desert night was alive with whispers, the soft sigh of the wind carrying secrets only the dunes could comprehend. Beneath the indigo sky scattered with countless stars, Paul Attreidees sat cross-legged at the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast expanse of sand. The glow of torches from the Freeman encampment below flickered like fireflies, a testament to their growing numbers and the unity forged through struggle. He closed his eyes, letting the desert speak to him. The spice was thick in the air, its presence a constant hum in his senses. It heightened everything: the beat of his heart, the distant sound of shifting sands, the haunting melody of Chani's voice as she sang a Freeman hymn somewhere in the camp. But tonight, something more profound stirred within him. Visions unfolded like layers of a dream, disjointed yet unmistakably clear. He saw cities burning, rivers of blood staining the sand, and his own face both revered and feared. The golden path shimmered before him, a choice that loomed as both salvation and doom. "Paul!" Chani's voice pulled him back to the present. He opened his eyes to find her standing behind him, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She stepped closer, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, settling beside him. "The people are waiting for your words." Paul sighed, his gaze returning to the horizon. "Words are easy, Chani. It's the weight behind them that's crushing." She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You carry too much alone. The Freemen follow you because they believe in you, but they also fight because they believe in themselves. Share the burden, Paul. Let them fight not just for you, but with you." Her words struck a chord, and Paul nodded slowly. "You're right, but there's something more. The visions are changing, growing more vivid. The paths ahead are chaotic." Chani's expression darkened. "The spice?" Paul hesitated. "Partly, but it's also the choices we've made, and the ones we have yet to make." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Stilgar. The Freeman leader bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that carried weight despite its simplicity. "Muad'Dib," Stilgar said, his voice steady. "The scouts have returned. They report increased Harkonnen patrols near the spice fields. The Sardaukar seem to be consolidating their forces." Paul rose to his feet, his demeanor shifting from introspection to command. "They're preparing for a decisive strike." Stilgar nodded. "It seems likely. They've underestimated us before, but they won't make the same mistake again." Paul's mind raced, calculating possibilities and strategies. The Freemen's victories had emboldened them, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. The Harkonnens and Sardaukar would not rest until they had eradicated the rebellion. "We need to strike first," Paul said, his tone resolute, "before they can bring their full strength to bear." Stilgar's eyes narrowed. A preemptive attack? Risky, but it could disrupt their plans. Paul turned to Chaney. "Gather the nabes. We need every leader in the siege to hear this. The next steps we take will determine the fate of Arrakis." The council convened in the largest chamber of the siege, a cavernous space lit by the soft glow of spice lamps. The air was thick with anticipation as Freeman leaders from across the desert assembled, their expressions ranging from determined to wary. Paul stood at the center, his presence commanding. Jessica watched from the shadows, her Bene Gesserit training allowing her to read the subtle shifts in the room's energy. She could see the respect the Freeman held for Paul, but also the undercurrent of fear. "The Harkonnens and Sardaukar are massing their forces," Paul began, his voice carrying through the chamber. "They aim to crush us in one decisive blow, but we will not give them that chance." He outlined his plan, a daring strategy that involved drawing the enemy into the deep desert, where the Freemen's knowledge of the terrain and their alliance with the sandworms would give them an edge. It was a gamble, but one that could turn the tide of the war. As Paul spoke, Stilgar observed the reactions of the nabes. Some nodded in agreement, their faith in Muad'Dib unshaken. Others exchanged skeptical glances, their doubt evident. When Paul finished, a silence fell over the chamber. It was Ferric, an elder nabe known for his bluntness, who finally spoke. "You ask much of us, Muad'Dib," Ferric said. "To face the Sardaukar and Harkonnen legions in open battle is to invite death. What assurance do we have that this plan will succeed?" Paul met Ferric's gaze, his own steady. "No plan comes without risk, Ferric. But consider this, if we do nothing, the enemy will come for us anyway, and they will not stop until every Freeman is dead. We must fight, not just for survival, but for freedom. For Arrakis." The room erupted in murmurs, the nabes debating among themselves. Jessica stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Paul speaks the truth," she said. "The path he offers is dangerous, but it is the only one that offers hope. The Bene Gesserit taught me to see patterns in chaos, and I see in Paul a leader who can unite the Freemen like no other." Her words carried weight, silencing the dissenters. Slowly, one by one, the nabes voiced their agreement, pledging their forces to the cause. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The Freemen prepared for the largest mobilization in their history, their resolve steeled by Paul's vision and leadership. As the siege buzzed with preparations, Paul and Chaney found moments of quiet amidst the chaos. One evening, as they stood on a ridge overlooking the encampment, Chaney turned to Paul. "Do you ever wonder what life would be like if none of this had happened?" she asked softly. Paul considered her question, his gaze distant. "Sometimes. But I don't think we were meant for a simple life, Chaney. The desert chose us, just as we chose it." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then we'll see this through. Together." Paul took her hand, their bond unspoken but undeniable. In that moment, amidst the uncertainty and the weight of prophecy, they found solace in each other. The final preparations were completed, and the Freeman forces moved out under the cover of darkness. Paul rode at the forefront, his crysknife at his side and the desert wind in his hair. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. As the stars wheeled overhead, Paul felt a surge of determination. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but he knew that the Freemen's strength and unity would carry them through. The desert whispered its secrets to him, and Paul Attreidees, Muad'Dib, listened. Chapter 7. The Emperor's Wrath. The desert shimmered under the unforgiving sun, the golden dunes stretching endlessly into the horizon. In the heart of this vast expanse, the Freeman forces lay hidden, their movements as silent and deliberate as the sands that surrounded them. Paul Attreidees stood among them, his expression a mask of calm determination as the weight of what lay ahead bore down on him. Word had reached the Siege that the Emperor himself had taken an interest in the rebellion. Reports of a massive imperial fleet, carrying an unprecedented number of Sardaukar, had sent ripples of anxiety through the Freeman ranks. The Emperor's wrath was not something to be taken lightly, but Paul knew that this confrontation was inevitable. It was always going to come to this, Paul said quietly to Stilgar as they stood on a ridge overlooking the Freeman encampment. Stilgar nodded, his face grim. "The Emperor's pride cannot tolerate the humiliation we've dealt the Harkonnens. He'll bring his full might to bear." Paul turned his gaze to the horizon, where a faint dust cloud signaled the approach of enemy forces. "Let him come," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "The desert will decide the outcome." The Imperial fleet descended upon Arrakis like a storm, its massive ships blotting out the sky as they landed near the Harkonnen stronghold. The Emperor had brought not only the Sardaukar, but also an array of advanced weaponry and armored vehicles, a show of force designed to crush any resistance. Within the gilded confines of his command center, Emperor Shaddam surveyed the desert landscape with a mixture of disdain and unease. Beside him stood Count Fenring, his trusted advisor, and Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who was seething with barely contained rage. "This rebellion should have been dealt with long ago," the Emperor said, his tone icy. "Your incompetence has forced me to intervene personally, Baron." Harkonnen's face darkened, but he bowed his head. "I assure you, Majesty, the Freemen are not to be underestimated. They fight with a ferocity that defies reason." "Excuses," Shaddam snapped. "We will see how ferocious they are when faced with the might of the Imperial Sardaukar." Paul's scouts brought news of the Imperial landing, confirming the size and scope of the enemy forces. The Freeman Council convened to discuss their next move, the atmosphere in the chamber tense but resolute. "They've brought their entire arsenal," Stilgar said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "The Sardaukar alone would be a formidable challenge, but with the Emperor's forces and weapons, this will be the greatest battle we've ever fought." Paul listened intently, his mind racing as he considered their options. "The Emperor's overconfidence is our greatest weapon," he said at last. "He doesn't understand the desert, and he doesn't understand us." He outlined his plan, a daring strategy that involved drawing the Imperial forces into the deep desert, where the Freemen's superior knowledge of the terrain and their alliance with the sandworms would give them an advantage. It was a high-risk gamble, but one that could turn the tide of the war. The Freeman leaders nodded in agreement, their faith in Paul unshaken. Jessica watched from the shadows, her sharp mind assessing every detail. She could see the strain in her son's eyes, the weight of leadership pressing down on him. Yet she also saw the fire that burned within him, a fire that would not be extinguished. As the Imperial forces advanced into the desert, the Freemen prepared for battle. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their movements swift and silent as they set traps and prepared ambushes. The sandworms, those massive creatures that ruled the desert, were an integral part of the plan. Paul's connection to the spice and the desert had deepened to the point where he could summon and control the worms with ease, a skill that filled the Freemen with awe and reverence. The battle began at dawn, the first rays of sunlight illuminating the vast expanse of sand as the Sardaukar marched into the heart of the desert. Paul watched from a hidden vantage point, his keen eyes taking in every detail. The enemy was disciplined and well-equipped, their movements precise and methodical. But they were unprepared for the fury of the desert. The first wave of attacks came from beneath the sand. Explosives planted by the Freemen detonated, throwing the Sardaukar into disarray. The Freemen emerged from their hiding places, striking with the ferocity of a sandstorm. They moved like shadows, their stillsuits blending seamlessly with the environment as they took down enemy soldiers with crysknives and lasguns. Paul fought at the forefront, his every movement a testament to his skill and determination. He wielded his crysknife with precision, cutting through the enemy with ruthless efficiency. Beside him, Cheney fought with equal ferocity, her blade flashing in the sunlight as she defended their position. The turning point came when the sandworms joined the battle. Drawn by the vibrations of the fighting, the massive creatures erupted from the dunes, their gaping maws swallowing soldiers and vehicles whole. The sight of the worms sent shockwaves through the Imperial ranks, their fear palpable. Paul used the chaos to his advantage, leading his forces in a coordinated assault that broke the Sardaukar's lines. The Freemen pressed their attack, their cries of Muad'Dib echoing across the battlefield. As the sun began to set, the battle drew to a close. The Imperial forces, their numbers decimated and their morale shattered, retreated under the cover of darkness. The Freemen gathered to assess their losses and tend to the wounded, their spirits buoyed by the hard-won victory. Paul stood amidst the carnage, his crysknife still in hand. The weight of the battle bore down on him, a stark reminder of the cost of rebellion. Yet as he looked at the faces of the Freemen around him, he saw something that gave him hope: determination, unity, and the unyielding spirit of a people who would not be broken. Stilgar approached, his expression one of pride and exhaustion. "The Sardaukar have been humbled," he said. "The Emperor will not take this defeat lightly." Paul nodded, his gaze distant. No, he won't. But this is only the beginning. The desert has chosen its champion, and the fight for Arrakis is far from over. That night, as the Freemen celebrated their victory, Paul found a moment of solitude. He climbed to the top of a dune, the stars above shining like beacons in the darkness. The desert whispered its secrets to him, and he listened, his resolve stronger than ever. Paul Attreidees, Muad'Dib, stood at the precipice of a new chapter in the battle for Arrakis. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not falter. The desert's wrath was his to command, and the Emperor's wrath would be met with the full might of the Freemen. Chapter 8. The Golden Path Unfolds. The sun rose over the dunes of Arrakis, casting long shadows across the golden expanse. The desert seemed quieter than usual, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of the storm yet to come. Paul Attreidees stood at the entrance of the Freemen's Sietch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He could feel the weight of the spice in the air, its presence sharpening his senses and amplifying the visions that haunted his mind. The victory against the Sardaukar had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. News of the Freemen's triumph had reached every corner of the Imperium, sowing both fear and admiration. But Paul knew the battle had only just begun. The Emperor's forces might have been defeated, but the Emperor himself remained a looming threat. Chani approached him, her presence grounding him amidst the chaos of his thoughts. She carried herself with the grace of a warrior, her crysknife glinting at her side. "You've been standing here for hours," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. Paul turned to her, his expression unreadable. "The visions are growing stronger," he admitted. "The paths ahead are tangled, and every choice I make seems to lead to more bloodshed." Chani placed a hand on his arm, her touch firm and reassuring. "You are Muad'Dib, the one the Freemen have been waiting for. Trust yourself, Paul. The desert has chosen you for a reason." Inside the Sietch, the Freemen were abuzz with activity. The leaders of the Sietch had convened in the central chamber, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. Stilgar stood at the head of the gathering, his presence commanding as he addressed the assembled nabes. "The Emperor will not let this defeat go unanswered," Stilgar said, his voice steady. "He will come for us, and he will bring the full might of the Imperium with him. We must be prepared." Paul entered the chamber, his presence silencing the room. The Freemen turned to him with expressions of reverence and expectation, their faith in Muad'Dib unshaken despite the challenges ahead. "The Emperor's wrath is inevitable," Paul said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "But we will not face him alone. The desert itself will be our ally, and the sandworms will fight alongside us. The Imperium has underestimated the Freemen for too long. It's time to show them the true power of Arrakis." The nabes exchanged nods of agreement, their resolve solidifying. Stilgar stepped forward, his expression grave. "What is your plan, Muad'Dib?" he asked. Paul outlined his strategy, a bold and unconventional plan that involved using the sandworms to attack the Emperor's forces directly. The Freemen had long revered the sandworms as the guardians of the desert, but Paul had forged a unique bond with them, a bond that would be crucial in the battles to come. As preparations began, Paul sought a moment of solitude. He retreated to a quiet corner of the Sietch, where he could meditate and focus his thoughts. The visions continued to plague him, flashes of fire and blood interspersed with glimpses of a golden future. He saw himself at the head of an unstoppable force, his name whispered in fear and reverence across the galaxy. Jessica found him there, her Bene Gesserit training allowing her to sense the turmoil within him. She approached cautiously, her presence a reminder of the complex web of politics and prophecy that had brought them to this point. "You're carrying too much, Paul," she said gently. "Even Muad'Dib cannot shoulder the weight of the galaxy alone." Paul looked at her, his expression weary. "Every choice I make seems to lead to more death, more destruction. The path ahead is steeped in blood, and I can't see a way to avoid it." Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were never meant to walk this path alone. Trust in those who follow you, and trust in yourself. The desert has chosen you for a reason." The day of the battle arrived, and the Freeman forces assembled in the deep desert. The sandworms, massive and awe-inspiring, loomed in the distance, their presence a testament to the power of Arrakis. Paul rode at the forefront, his crysknife gleaming in the sunlight. The Emperor's forces had deployed their full might, a massive army of Sardaukar and advanced weaponry. The desert was alive with the hum of machinery and the shouts of soldiers, the tension palpable as both sides prepared for the confrontation. Paul raised his hand, signaling the freemen to hold their positions. He could feel the desert beneath him, the pulse of the sandworms as they awaited his command. The spice-laden air heightened his awareness, every sound and movement amplified. The battle began with a deafening roar as the freemen launched their attack. The sandworms surged forward, their massive forms tearing through the enemy ranks with terrifying efficiency. The Sardaukar fought valiantly, their discipline and training evident, but they were no match for the combined might of the freemen and the desert itself. Paul led the charge, his movements fluid and precise as he cut through the enemy with his crysknife. Beside him, Chani fought with equal ferocity, her blade a blur as she defended their position. The cries of Muad'Dib echoed across the battlefield, a rallying cry that spurred the freemen to greater heights. The Emperor's forces began to falter, their confidence shattered by the sheer ferocity of the freemen assault. The sandworms continued their rampage, their massive forms carving a path of destruction through the enemy lines. As the sun began to set, the battle drew to a close. The freemen emerged victorious, their triumph a testament to their strength and resilience. The Emperor's forces were in disarray, their once mighty army reduced to scattered remnants. Paul stood amidst the aftermath, his crysknife still in hand. The weight of the battle bore down on him, a stark reminder of the cost of rebellion. Yet as he looked at the faces of the freemen around him, he saw something that gave him hope: determination, unity, and the unyielding spirit of a people who would not be broken. Stilgar approached, his expression a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "The Emperor's forces have been routed," he said. "The desert is ours." Paul nodded, his gaze distant. "This victory is only the beginning. The fight for Arrakis is far from over." As the stars emerged in the night sky, Paul found a moment of quiet reflection. The visions still haunted him, the golden path stretching endlessly before him. But for now, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Paul Attreidees Muad'Dib stood at the precipice of a new chapter in the battle for Arrakis. The desert had chosen its champion, and the path ahead was clear. The Imperium would not soon forget the name Muad'Dib. Chapter 9. The Emperor's Fall. The air on Arrakis was heavy with tension, the quiet before a storm that promised to change the course of history. Paul Attreidees stood on a rise overlooking the Freeman forces as they prepared for the final push against the Emperor's forces. The desert stretched out endlessly before him, the golden sands shimmering under the twin suns. He could feel the pulse of the desert, its power coursing through him, and he knew that this day would mark a turning point not just for Arrakis, but for the entire Imperium. The Freemen had achieved victory after victory, their guerrilla tactics and intimate knowledge of the desert overwhelming even the Sardaukar. But the Emperor Shaddam IV had refused to admit defeat. With his forces decimated, he had fortified himself in Arrakis, the planetary capital, alongside Baron Vladimir Harkonnen and the remnants of their armies. Paul's visions had been growing more vivid, showing him the golden path ahead, a path fraught with sacrifice and destruction. He had accepted the mantle of Muad'Dib, the prophesied leader, but the weight of that responsibility bore down on him like never before. The decisions he made today would echo across the galaxy for generations. Chani approached him, her presence a steadying force amidst the chaos of his thoughts. "The men are ready," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "They await your command." Paul turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Today we end this," he said. "The Emperor believes himself untouchable, but he doesn't understand the desert. He doesn't understand us." Chani nodded, her gaze unwavering. "He will learn." The Freeman forces moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their every action a testament to their discipline and unity. Paul had devised a bold plan, one that relied on the Freemen's mastery of the desert and their unique bond with the sandworms. The Emperor's forces had fortified Arrakis, but they had not accounted for the power of the desert itself. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the Freemen began their march toward the city. Paul rode at the forefront, mounted on the back of a massive sandworm. The creature moved with a grace that belied its size, its every motion a reminder of the primal power of Arrakis. Behind him, the Freemen followed, their still suits blending seamlessly with the sands. The sight of the advancing army sent waves of panic through the Emperor's forces. From the walls of Arrakis, Sardaukar soldiers scrambled to prepare their defenses, their fear palpable. The Emperor himself watched from his command center, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Muad'Dib," he muttered, the name dripping with contempt. He dares to challenge the might of the Imperium? Beside him, Baron Harkonnen sneered. He's nothing more than a desert rat. We'll crush him. But the Emperor was not so sure. Reports of the Freemen's victories had unsettled him, and the sight of the sandworms, creatures that had always been a source of fear and mystery, only added to his unease. The battle began with an earth-shaking roar as the sandworms surged forward, their massive forms tearing through the city's defenses. The Freemen followed close behind, their cries of Muad'Dib echoing across the battlefield. The Sardaukar fought valiantly, their discipline and training evident, but they were no match for the Freemen's ferocity and the sheer power of the sandworms. Paul led the charge, his crysknife flashing in the sunlight as he cut through the enemy. Beside him, Chani fought with equal determination, her every movement a testament to her skill and resolve. The Freemen moved like shadows, their still suits blending seamlessly with the environment as they overwhelmed the defenders. The city descended into chaos as the Freemen advanced, their relentless assault breaking through the Sardaukar's lines. Explosions rocked the city as Freemen saboteurs targeted key structures, further destabilizing the enemy. The sandworms continued their rampage, their massive forms carving a path of destruction through the city. Inside the Emperor's command center, the tension was palpable. Shaddamfor watched in horror as his forces crumbled under the onslaught. "This is impossible," he muttered, his voice shaking with disbelief. "The Sardaukar are the finest soldiers in the galaxy. How can they be losing to these savages?" Baron Harkonnen's face was pale, his usual bluster gone. "We must retreat," he said, his voice uncharacteristically timid. "We can regroup." "There will be no retreat," the Emperor snapped, his eyes blazing with fury. "This rebellion ends here, or I will see Arrakis reduced to ashes." But even as he spoke, it was clear that the battle was lost. The Freemen were unstoppable, their determination and unity overcoming even the most formidable defenses. Paul reached the command center as the battle neared its climax. The Freemen forces had overwhelmed the city, and the Emperor's remaining troops were surrendering or fleeing in disarray. Paul entered the chamber with Chani and Stilgar at his side, his expression cold and resolute. Shaddamfor stood at the center of the room, his regal facade cracking under the weight of his defeat. Baron Harkonnen cowered beside him, his usual arrogance replaced by fear. "So, this is the great Muad'Dib," the Emperor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A desert boy who thinks he can challenge the throne." Paul's gaze was steady, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about the throne. This is about justice. You brought this upon yourself, Emperor. Your greed, your cruelty, it ends today." The Emperor sneered. "And what do you intend to do? Kill me and take my place? Become the tyrant you claim to despise." Paul stepped closer, his crysknife in hand. "I don't seek power for its own sake. I seek to free Arrakis, to give its people control of their own destiny." The confrontation ended with the Emperor's surrender, his once mighty authority shattered. Paul spared his life, choosing instead to exile him and dismantle the corrupt structures of the Imperium. The Baron was not so fortunate. His long history of cruelty and betrayal earned him a swift and brutal end at the hands of the Freemen. As the sun set over Arrakis, the city began to rebuild, its people united under a new banner. Paul stood on a balcony overlooking the city, his expression thoughtful as he considered the path ahead. The fight for Arrakis was over, but the challenges of leadership were only just beginning. Chani joined him, her presence a comforting reminder that he was not alone. "The people look to you, Muad'Dib," she said softly. "What will you do now?" Paul gazed out at the horizon, the golden sands of the desert stretching endlessly before him. "We build a future," he said, "one where the people of Arrakis are free, and the desert is no longer a tool of oppression. But the golden path is long, and it will not be easy." Together, they stood as the stars emerged in the night sky, their light a symbol of hope and possibility. The desert had chosen its champion, and under Paul Attreidees, Arrakis would rise anew. Chapter 10. The Golden Path. The echoes of victory reverberated across Arrakis, carried on the desert winds like the whisper of a new dawn. Paul Attreidees, now known across the galaxy as Muad'Dib, stood atop the highest tower of the newly reconstructed Arrakis Palace. From this vantage point, the vast expanse of the desert stretched out endlessly, its golden dunes shimmering beneath the twin suns. For the first time in generations, Arrakis felt alive, free from the oppressive weight of Harkonnen cruelty and imperial exploitation. The city below bustled with activity as freemen and offworlders worked together to rebuild. The scars of war were evident, but so too was the resilience of the people. The freemen, long relegated to the shadows of the desert, now walked openly as the rightful stewards of their world. Offworlders, once drawn solely by the lure of spice, were learning to respect the harsh beauty of Arrakis and its people. Paul's rise to power had been swift and transformative, but it was not without cost. His path to victory had been paved with sacrifice, and the weight of those sacrifices hung heavy on his shoulders. He had defeated the Emperor, dismantled the Harkonnen dynasty, and shattered the Sardaukars' myth of invincibility. Yet, as he gazed out over the desert, he knew that his greatest challenges lay ahead. The council chamber of the palace was filled with the voices of leaders and advisors, each representing a piece of the new Imperium. Stilgar sat at Paul's right hand, his presence a symbol of the freeman's central role in shaping the future. Chani stood nearby, her watchful gaze a reminder of the personal stakes in every decision. Princess Irulan, Paul's political bride, maintained a composed silence, her role as the Emperor's daughter lending legitimacy to Paul's rule. The discussion was heated, centering on the redistribution of power and the future of the spice trade. The spice melange, the lifeblood of the galaxy, remained the most valuable resource in existence. Control of its production gave Paul unprecedented leverage, but it also made Arrakis a target for those who sought to exploit it. "We must tread carefully," Stilgar cautioned, his deep voice cutting through the din. "The spice is our greatest strength, but it is also our greatest vulnerability. If we hoard it, we invite rebellion. If we share it too freely, we risk losing control." Paul nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The spice must be a tool for unity, not division. We will set new terms, fairer terms, but we will also ensure that Arrakis remains sovereign. The days of exploitation are over." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Paul's vision for the future was clear, but the path to achieving it was fraught with uncertainty. The Imperium was vast, its power structures deeply entrenched. Overcoming centuries of corruption and greed would require not just strength, but wisdom and patience. As the council dispersed, Paul retreated to his private chambers, seeking a moment of solitude. The room was sparsely furnished, its simplicity a reflection of the freeman way of life. He sank into a chair, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The visions that had guided him thus far were changing, becoming more fragmented and ambiguous. The golden path he had glimpsed was still there, but its edges were blurred, its contours uncertain. Paul had always understood that his prescience was both a gift and a burden. It allowed him to see possibilities, but it did not guarantee outcomes. Chani entered the room, her presence a balm to his troubled mind. She crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You've been carrying this weight alone for too long," she said softly. "You don't have to bear it all yourself." Paul reached up to cover her hand with his own, drawing strength from her unwavering support. "I know," he said, "but the decisions I make now will shape the future of billions. I can't afford to make mistakes." Chani knelt beside him, her gaze steady. "You're not alone, Paul. You have me, you have Stilgar, and you have the Freeman. We'll face whatever comes together." Her words were a reminder of the bond they shared, a bond forged in the crucible of the desert. Paul leaned down to press a kiss to her forehead, his resolve strengthening. The following weeks were a blur of activity as Paul worked to solidify his rule. Treaties were negotiated, alliances forged, and the foundations of a new imperium laid. The great houses of the Landsraad, wary but pragmatic, pledged their support, recognizing that resistance was futile. The Spacing Guild, reliant on spice for their navigators, begrudgingly accepted the new terms of trade. But not everyone was willing to accept Paul's authority. Across the galaxy, pockets of resistance emerged, fueled by fear and resentment. The remnants of the Sardaukar, loyal to the deposed emperor, launched a series of guerrilla attacks on spice facilities. In response, Paul deployed freeman warriors, their unparalleled desert skills proving invaluable in quelling the uprisings. Each victory came at a cost, the toll of constant conflict weighing heavily on Paul and his people. The freemen, though fierce and resourceful, were not invincible. Every loss was a reminder of the price of freedom, a price Paul was determined to honor. One evening, as the twin moons of Arrakis rose over the desert, Paul stood alone on a balcony overlooking the dunes. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the heat of the day, but it did little to ease his troubled mind. The golden path stretched out before him, a vision of a future filled with both promise and peril. He saw the potential for unity, for a galaxy no longer bound by greed and oppression. But he also saw the cost, the sacrifices that would be required to achieve that vision. Paul knew that his journey was far from over. He had won the battle for Arrakis, but the war for the soul of the Imperium was only just beginning. As Muad'Dib, he was more than a leader. He was a symbol, a beacon of hope for some and a figure of fear for others. As he gazed out at the horizon, the sands of Arrakis shifting in the moonlight, Paul made a silent vow. He would follow the golden path, no matter where it led, no matter the cost. For the sake of Arrakis, for the freemen, and for the countless lives that depended on his vision, he would endure. The desert wind whispered around him, carrying with it the promise of a new dawn. And as the first light of morning broke over the horizon, Paul Attreidees stood resolute, ready to face whatever the future held. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this epic journey. Your support means the world, and it's because of amazing listeners like you that we can continue sharing these incredible stories. If you enjoyed this adventure, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on future releases. By liking and sharing, you're helping us reach more people who love captivating tales just like you. Subscribing ensures you'll never miss a story. We have so many exciting adventures lined up that we can't wait to share with you. Look forward to even more thrilling, emotional, and unforgettable stories that will take you to new worlds, introduce you to remarkable characters, and ignite your imagination. Stay tuned. This is just the beginning of an amazing storytelling journey, and we're thrilled to have you along for the ride. Thank you once again, and see you in the next adventure.